This is Chapter 11, Gothic Art and Architecture. And for the first time, we're really going to spend a lot of time discussing architecture. The Gothic period, let me get you a map, something interesting to look at. So the Gothic period has a revolution of thinking, a revolution of architecture, a revolution of style. Europe is changing. The countries are becoming more cohesive units. Um, and there's also a softening. That whole idea of the Romanesque period of being afraid of death and doing whatever you could to stay out of hell, and knowing that there was nothing good about you, feeling like you were a worthless worm, that if you didn't do something extraordinary, you would be going to hell. The whole idea of grace as a Christian principle, a theological principle, does not exist in the Romanesque period. It's all about fear. But things change in the Gothic period, and there's a few reasons for that. I'm not going to try to connect the dots, but I want you to get the big idea. And one is that St. Francis of Assisi, who lived, I believe, in the 11th century, 11th or 12th century, had a revolutionary idea where he challenged the Pope to live simply. He thought people should live simply, should love each other. He saw creation as good. He talked to birds. He honored the creation and pointed out to people that the very Bible said that God created everything and called it good. It's just revolutionary compared to the Romanesque period and earlier periods. So people are starting to look at the world around them with new eyes and appreciate the here and now, to appreciate their lives. So you see that happen. And then you've got this growing presence of the Virgin Mary, where before all of the thoughts of Christianity had been largely male dominated, that God was personified as a male, as a man sitting up in heaven, which is, I don't know. And Jesus obviously was a male, but now the Virgin Mary's role becomes emphasized, and there's a lot of reasons for this, which I won't go into, but she does grow immensely in popularity in the Gothic period. And that's because she is relatable. People relate to her like they would their mother, like somebody who is soft and nurturing, warm and loving. And so images of Virgin Mary cradling baby Jesus are very popular. And anyway, you will see all of this as we progress through here. So the Romanesque period just doesn't end abruptly overnight. In fact, the pilgrimage tradition continued, and it's because of the pilgrimage tradition that the Gothic architecture evolves. So I'm going to move here and we'll start with architecture. A distinctive new style arose in the Ile-de-France. That's just a big section in central France that's centered around the Seine River. In the mid-12th century. It was termed Gothic much later by 16th century art historian Giorgio Vasari, who attributed the then old-fashioned style to the Goths, yeah, those barbaric Goths, that destroyed classical civilization. More lifelike depictions emerged. Crusades and pilgrimages continued. So this is the origins of Gothic architecture in this little church in Saint-Denis, which it was a separate village outside of Paris, very near Paris, but now it's in the suburbs of Paris. So construction of the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis began in the 1130s. The impetus was the inability to accommodate crowds of pilgrims in the older Romanesque building. The abbot, Suger, wanted to open up the space, but also desired to make larger windows to allow the sunlight to enter the church. The plan of the choir retains features of the Romanesque pilgrimage church including a semicircular apse surrounded by an ambulatory. So we're going to look at this, a little enlarged picture here. So this shows the plan of this redesign. So this is because pilgrims would come here and the remains of Saint-Denis were here, and he performed a miracle. He walked around after his head had been removed from his body. I mean, it's really quite something. But this is what Suger had his builders do. Open up this ambulatory wall. Instead of having these little distinct chapels like we had in Santiago, we have these just barely rounded little spots. And these white areas are windows. And then this thing that looks kind of arrow-shaped represents a buttress. So the stone, the whole idea of this is that you open up the wall, let light come in, but you still have to have something there to support the roof, because the roof is made of stone and all that weight is coming down, coming down, coming down. So the piers you can see here are supporting the roof, and then you have a little buttressing here that supports the roof. I'll show you more. But I think I have another text slide. Suger really believed that he had read a philosopher that said that God was present in light, and so Suger's idea was to fill his church with light and sort of remind people of the omnipresent God in their lives. So here's the apse at Saint-Denis, and you can see these little curved walls and lots of windows. You can see the buttressing here. Then here's something new. Up above on this upper part, he wanted buttressing, but he instead of like putting it flush up against the wall and having to take up more space, he just put the buttress outside of the wall and connected it to the wall with this arm. So that's called a flying buttress. So flying buttresses here support the roof, allowing the walls to be used for windows instead of structural support. So here's some of the glass that was in Saint-Denis that would have it would have created this beautiful purplish light, because you can see it's red and blue mostly. So non-load-bearing walls contain colorful stained glass. This enabled the Holy Spirit via the light from heaven to enter the worship space. The window of the flight into Egypt is a well-preserved example. It is painted with vitreous enamel. Mary picking a date from a palm tree is a scene from an apocryphal gospel. So she's picking a date to eat as sort of candy. So, origins of Gothic architecture. A new model of architecture allowed spacious, adaptable skeletal framework that supported rib vaulting. So rib vaulting is much thinner and lighter. Slender piers allowed for the tallest yet churches with large expanses of stained glass. Notice the pointed arches. So that's one of the characteristics also, is pointed arches. And so this is the arch, and this is the webbing. So webbing is just kind of filled in. It's a completely different structure than the Romanesque or groin vaulting. So Chartres Cathedral. This is a very early Gothic structure that was also a remodel. So Saint-Denis was a remodel of a Romanesque, and Chartres also is a remodel, but it's much more extensive than the Saint-Denis remodel. So Chartres illustrates the many aspects of Gothic architecture: elaborate sculpture programs, pointed arch, stained glass, flying buttress, soaring verticality, and a rose window. And you'll see all those things. This is called, Notre Dame de Chartres. From this point on, most churches are dedicated to the Virgin Mary because her popularity has become so great, and she resonates with people. People adore the Virgin Mary. It's like a resurgence in their fervor, their religious fervor. So you can see the two spires here on the west end. are different. They were built at different times, and the later one, instead of modeling or copying the first one, just decided to go contemporary and do what was being done there. I should also say, while we're looking at this, two important factoids about cathedrals. And one is that not all large churches are cathedrals. A cathedral is a very specific, it plays a role in the hierarchy of the church. It is the seat of a bishop. So the word cathedral comes from the Latin for chair. And so if it's a bishop's church, then it's a cathedral. If it's not a bishop's church, it's just a church. You might call it a basilica, whatever. And another factoid is that most churches have the apse at the east end. That's the focal point of the church where the altar is, and people enter on the west. So you would enter here and walk down towards the east. And the reason for that is that people believed that Jesus would come again soon, and that when Jesus came again, he would rise up over the eastern horizon like the sun. And if they were facing east, then they would be in a position to see him when he first shows up or something like that. But it just becomes the convention, and churches are built like that with very, very few exceptions. So that's why we can refer to the main entrance as always as the west end or the west facade of the churches, because they're always west. So here's the west facade of Notre Dame, also known as Virgin Mary. Notre Dame just literally means Our Lady. And this is at Chartres, and it contains a sculptural program that includes a royal portal over 3 doors and jam statues. So we looked at Romanesque tympana, and we looked at how the iconography on them, that means the subject matter, the iconography was a little bit scary, and there was judgment. So people would feel scared and compliant and willing to do whatever to get out of hell. So Gothic tympana don't usually use that iconography. They're much more positive and not negative. So we have Christ in majesty. We've got the Virgin Mary over here on this tympanum, and Jesus in glory here. But one of the innovations at Chartres is these columnar figures on either side of the door. And there's special vocabulary here, but you don't need to worry about that unless you take Art History 1, and then I'm sure you'd have to know that. But these columnar figures were of kings and queens of France, and you can see how their forms are sort of stretched out and elongated to sort of simulate the columns, but mostly just to sort of affirm the presence of God here. And this is the interior of Chartres, so showing its huge difference compared to the Romanesque, its soaring verticality. So I've pointed out the various elements of the building here. It codified Gothic structural devices, and following Chartres, lots of churches follow this, and there's a lot of imitation and adaptation of ideas from Chartres. So ribbed groin vaults up in the roof, and a short triforium. So that's this little gallery here, this little passageway where you could walk, and there are little columns that separate you from the church. The nave, and pointed arches. These are not dramatically pointed, but just a very subtle point. Bundled piers means that the stones of the piers are cut so as to look like they are several smaller shafts of stone bundled together, and we just call that bundled piers. They're not really, it's just an illusion, but it makes it seem lighter. And the soaring verticality, so this huge vertical space. If you look at the pews, this is where humans sit, And this is just nothing but empty space up here. It was not used, it was not occupied. All of this is just to give the people who attend Mass the sense that they've been elevated, they've been removed from their everyday life into something heavenly, into a spiritual realm, closer to heaven, undoubtedly. Extensive figural decorations of stained glass and sculpture, so lots and lots of stained glass here. Most people were illiterate, and I showed you some sculpture in the Romanesque period, and I said its purpose was to sort of illustrate Bible stories and remind people of those stories in visual forms. So same thing with the stained glass here. It should all be recognizable by the people who were there, and they could read the stained glass. And here, side by side, and I attempted to put these in the same scale by sort of shrinking the Romanesque, but on the left you've got Santiago de Compostela in Spain, the Romanesque pilgrimage church that we looked at, and on the right you've got Notre Dame in Chartres. It's breathtakingly different. I hope you see that. And you can also see how much more light there is in the Gothic church, and stained glass. Yeah. So, Gothic versus Romanesque. And here's another comparison, the two plans of Santiago on the left and Chartres on the right. So you can see many differences. Around the choir, which is this large part here, there are two side aisles. And instead of having all these little discrete chapels like we saw in Santiago, we've just got these barely bulging little rounded areas. So there would be something in there, but it's not nearly the same structure. And you can see the windows, all the glass in Santiago is very small because all of these dark blobs along the walls are what supports the roof. And in Chartres, you can see a lot of glass, a lot of openings here. And right down here on the nave, you can even see buttressing, which just sort of supports that work of the wall to support the roof. You can also notice the choir is much larger, and the transept is really small. The transept has just 3 bays, so 1, 2, 3 bays, and more bays here in Santiago. It's not quite that clear because we are barrel vaulted there. And here is the view of Chartres again with its plan. This is a labyrinth which was inscribed on the floor, and it's like a maze, just a circular maze where people would pray as they walked through this labyrinth and pray, of course, to the Virgin Mary. And in their minds, the Virgin Mary was very accessible and loving and kind and gentle and supportive of them in their very mundane lives. There were elaborate sculpture programs on both of the porches. We're just not going to have a chance to look at them. And I've already shown you some of the sculpture on the west portal. So here again is Chartres. There's all the parts of the building that are labeled, which you don't have to worry about. If you wonder how much of this is going to be required for the quiz, be sure to look at the review sheet for the quiz, because very, very little specifically. But rose window and flying buttress are definitely required. So there's Chartres. Now here's the flying buttress. So this is what I was describing at Saint-Denis, this sort of arm that reaches out. This is the church. This is the nave here. And this is a buttress, which is a very strong tower, but it's apart from the church. And it's connected to it by these stone arms that reach out, just like your arm would reach out to hold up a wall. It's like that. And it supports it without requiring a lot of blockage on this side. So it's able to be open for stained glass. This is what it looks like here. So the force of the weight of the heavy vaulted roof is transferred to external piers by the use of flying buttresses. Walls are freed of any structural task and can be filled with stained glass. I hope you get that. It's a quiz question. The purpose of flying buttresses was to enable stained glass to be placed in the church. Most of the stained glass of Chartres Cathedral is intact, including the Good Samaritan window in the nave aisle. So you can see here this little quatrefoil, which means a four-leafed shape, and figures in here of the Good Samaritan story. I don't know. You can look at it. And more windows. So Chartres is loaded with glass. Other windows tell moralizing tales of saints and heroes or depict iconic ensembles. The rose window here floats above 5 lancets that glorify the Virgin Mary. So this is called a rose window, and this was new to Gothic architecture. Almost always put on an end wall, the end of a transept or the end of the nave. And it shows you right off the bat that this entire width, this huge part of the wall did not have to support the roof at all. The work is all being done externally by flying buttresses somewhere else. So the Virgin Mary sits in the middle in this little roundel, and then all of these little sections would have some iconography that relates to the Virgin Mary. It would all be connected thematically. Nothing is just by chance. They just don't fill stuff in. Everything is purposeful. These are lancet windows down here, and they represent biblical kings. I believe, I think this one over here on the right with the red hat is King David. Fleur-de-lis appear in a shield under St. Anne, and quatrefoils within the rose representing the royal lineage of King Louis IX. So like I said, everything has a purpose. Nothing is just filler. Let's look at another early Gothic cathedral. This one is a little more famous. You've probably seen pictures of it. It is Notre Dame in Paris. This church is a bridge between Suger's Abbey Church and 13th century Chartres, which you just saw. Construction on this began in 1163. A new master mason transformed the clerestory into double lancet windows. So that was one of the big innovations on this. It's very picturesque because it sits on an island in the middle of the Seine River, so it's right up against the embankment here. So it allows people to get a good view of it. And you can see over here, I've put an arrow in to point to the flying buttress. That will show up on the quiz. I think you have to identify that. You can see here a rose window. This is the transept. There's a very ornate tower over the crossing of the transept and nave, but that was added later. And the west end does not have any spires on the towers. Here's a photograph of this. The west facade was erected between 1200 and 1250, and you could say it was never finished. A very small rose window here. This, again, is early Gothic, so things are a little smaller scale. And tragically, there was a horrendous fire there last year, 2019, and much of the roof was destroyed. There was a lot of internal damage as well, so it's very sad. All the pictures that I'm showing you of the church were taken before the fire, except for this one. So, and here's Paris on the left, Chartres on the right, both early Gothic. So just notice how there's a lot of heavy stonework, a lot of undecorated stone here. That's not glass either, so there's solid stone here, a lot of stone. Okay, you're getting that. And then we have a very late Gothic here. This is REIMS, so I'm showing you that the earliest examples of the Gothic style are quite different from the later examples, where things get increasingly ornate, and increasingly there's like more figures carved on it, more ornate stonework, open work, and the towers. And one of my favorite things about REMS, this is REMS here, is that there are two rose windows on the west end. There's one up above, and then down here over the main portal or door, instead of having a tympanum of sculpture, they have put in another smaller rose window and kind of created these squinchy shapes to adjust from the circle to the pointed arch. I love that. I've never been to REMS, but it's on my bucket list. So we're going to look at these sculptures right over here next to the main portal. So we'll look at those presently. So new developments in late Gothic architecture, more intricate stonework, more stained glass, including small rose window and tympanum. This is REMS. This happens to be the coronation church of the French monarch. So anytime a new king was crowned, he would come to this church to have that ceremony. And this is the interior, and I think you should see why it's on my bucket list. So just looking back towards that west end, and you can see these two rose windows there, and then this splendid, gorgeous interior here of REMS. Love it. So here's those sculptures that I pointed to on the facade, and I said we were going to look at. We're not really going to spend much time on figural art right now, but part 2 we'll get into figural art much more. So it's basically been architecture. But these 4 figures are kind of unique, and they're very distinct and new compared to what we saw in the Romanesque period. So that's where we're stopping to look at them. So there's 2 pairs. There's a pair here and a pair here, and you can now, looking at those, they do look a little more similar. This pair looks completely different from this pair. And if you were guessing which one was the older pair, you would probably say the one on the left, but it's just the opposite. The pair on the right is older. But we're going to look at the older pair because they represent something significant in Gothic figural art, and that is this this Gothic S-curve. This was a style that evolved in France where a figure is standing contrapposto, and that's kind of new. It's the Gothic period. And her body sort of gently conforms to that S, the Gothic S, and the knee pops out. So both of these figures have the same pose. It's accentuated by the fact that these women have grabbed their robe and over their left hip, which causes these diagonal lines that radiate out. It's just a trend at this time. So it shows that the artist was conforming or perhaps setting the trend, but I'm going to show you more examples of it. This is called the Visitation. This is the Virgin Mary, and this is her cousin Elizabeth. And it comes from the Bible. It's a story in the Bible where Mary and Elizabeth visited when they were both pregnant. And over here is the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel and Mary. So REMS is famous for its sculpture. The west facade portrays the Visitation in the right pair of statues. Stylistically, their idealized faces resemble Roman statues. The left pair of statues portrays the Annunciation. These were the work of different sculptors who created tall, graceful figures in international Gothic style. So let's move on. Here are 2 Gothic cathedral plans, also showing you early and late. So REMS is on the right. REMS has really thinned out. It's cut that transept down to almost nothing, just 2 bays here, barely negligible. And then these little chapels. So REMS is the most advanced. Chartres was still figuring out this new form. Chartres was innovative, and then REMS takes that ball and runs with it. Here's something interesting. So I told you that this style, which other countries called the French style, catches on and people are copying it and wanting to build one of these big newfangled churches. The whole concept of raising money and actual construction is another whole area of interest, but we're not going to go into that. And this shows you how they competed to be taller. So that would seem to be a medieval concern. Everybody wanted to outdo other people and get ever taller. And in fact, the one that was actually achieving the greatest height ever had overreached its structural integrity and it collapsed, and so it never was finished. You can find that information elsewhere. I think there is a link to the film Cathedral on Canvas, which is an animated, partly animated film, but it also explains the structure of cathedrals. You can watch that. It's really fun. So here we have short and getting taller, taller, taller to Amiens over here on the right. And here's REIMS. So sort of the high point or the end point of this evolution is a church that becomes almost purely glass. If glass was the desired addition or the desired state of a Gothic cathedral, this one achieves it in this Sainte-Chapelle. It is in Paris. This was built as a royal chapel for the king's use exclusively, just for the king and his family. So it's in Paris, the capital city. There is no side aisle. It's just a nave, just one single large room, and lots of ribs and lots of stained glass, lots of lancet windows in Sainte-Chapelle. Sainte-Chapelle pushed the use of stained glass to its limit. Narrative cycles are easily legible in spite of their complexity. Standard themes relating to the Mass decorate the sanctuary's hemicycle. That's half a circle. Among the scenes of kings and queens of Judah are scenes of Louis IX and the French royal house. So he also built this, not just for his personal use at Mass, but to house his very special collection of relics. So that idea of relics, that was very popular in the Romanesque period, with people going on pilgrimage to be near relics. I don't know, it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop for anything. So the king had acquired the best relics in the whole world, and they included the crown of thorns that had been placed on Jesus' head when he was tortured just before his crucifixion, the lance that had pierced Jesus' side when he was on the cross, the sponge that had held the vinegar that was put in Jesus' mouth when he was on the cross, and a piece of the cross. So these are the best relics you could get, because they were all things that had touched Jesus, and not some little local saint, but the actual Lord. So sadly, the collection of relics in this beautiful structure were not open to the public. You and I could not have walked in there. Only the king and his family and whoever else he happened to invite in could go in there. But there is a chamber at ground level under this that was, to my understanding, was open to the public. So you could go in there and be near those relics, but you could never see them or touch them. You just knew that they were near you. So it's kind of like, you can think of Sainte-Chapelle as like a giant reliquary. It's a big ornate structure that was made to hold those objects. Here's a picture I recently found on the internet of that chapel, taken with a very distorting lens, but it sure makes it look special, doesn't it? So this is sort of the high point of Gothic. This is the end of Chapter 11, Part 1, Gothic architecture, mostly in France.